The data grid control is a full-featured grid for not only viewing but also editing data. There are several ways you can add one to a window. You can type XAML, of course. You can drag a data grid control from the toolbox and then set its properties. Again, either in XAML or using the Properties window. You can also drag an object from the Data Sources window. By default, Visual Studio will create a data grid. And regardless of how you got the data grid into the window, you set the item source property to bind it to data. And you set that item source property to some collection. You have several options for defining columns. As always, you can type them in XAML. You can use the Collection Editor Columns dialog box. You can also let the runtime automatically generate columns for you. The data grid has a number of properties you can use to control its behavior. The Auto Generate Columns property determines whether or not you let the runtime generate columns for you. If you're using an object with 37 columns, you probably won't display them all. So in that case, you'll probably define them yourself. If you were showing an order ID and 3 dates, then you might let the runtime generate the columns for you. So it's going to kind of depend on how many columns you have and what size they wind up being. You can set the alternating row background property and specify a color, so every other row is that color. You can control the width of the row header, and that's the box you click to select the row. Each column has a default width. If you want to increase or decrease it, then you can set the column width property. And you can determine whether or not column and row headers are visible by using the headers visibility property. You can control whether or not horizontal and vertical grid lines display by using the grid lines visibility property. And you can control whether or not you select the entire row or just a single cell when you click somewhere in the data grid, and you can do that by using the selection unit property. And the selection mode property can be used to determine whether or not you select only one row at a time or more than one row. You can control whether or not users can change the order of columns by setting the Can User Reorder Columns property. By default, users can resize columns. That's why the column width property is the default column width. You can take away that capability by setting Can User Resize Columns to false. Similarly, you can control whether or not users can resize rows. And then you can control whether or not users can sort columns by clicking on the header. So let's go take a look at data grids. I have the Data Grid Demo sample project open. Here's the simple Data Grid 1 window, and I'm going to display customers in the data grid and then explore various properties of the data grid. So let's run this first. And here's the grid. I'm displaying customers in the grid. I have all of the customers, so every row, and all of the customer information, so all of the information for the customer. And then notice that each column is sized differently. The columns are sized to be wide enough to display the content. Let's look at the XAML. Here's my data grid. It has a name, height and width, and then I've set the alternating row background property to beige, and that's why every other row is in beige. And I've left the Auto Generate Columns property at its default of true, so the runtime generates one column for every property in the customer object, and that's why automatically I see all of the information for the customer. So by default, the column widths are wide enough to display the widest piece of information. So company name is wide enough to display the widest company name. Address is wide enough to display the widest address. You have a number of options for setting the column width. Let's take a look at those. you can set the column width property to size to header, and then each column will be wide enough to display the header. And you can see in many cases that's going to cut off the content. The default is size to cells, which will be wide enough to display the content, but in this case it cuts off the header. So the third option would be column width equals auto, which would size each column to either as wide as the column header or as wide as the content. You can specify specific numbers, so here I'm saying column width equals 100, every column is 100 wide. And finally, if I set column width equal to star, then every column is a proportionate width. So I have 12 columns, so each column would be 1/12 of the width of the grid. Okay, let's go back to the main window. Let's take a look at some of the properties we can set to customize how the grid looks and behaves. The header's visibility property determines whether or not I see column or row headers. The default is all, so I've got column headers here and row headers here. If I set it to column, then I don't get row headers, I just get column headers. If I set it to row, then I don't see column headers, I just see row headers, and I can turn them both off by setting the header's visibility property of the grid to none. By default, I see both horizontal and vertical grid lines. If I set the grid line's visibility property to horizontal, then I only see horizontal grid lines. I can see just vertical grid lines. If I set that property to none, I don't see any grid lines. The selection unit property determines whether or not I select the entire row when I click in a cell. So the default is full row, and if I click in any cell, I select the entire row. If I change that to cell, then I only select the actual cell, not the entire row. And in this case, I can't select the entire row at all. If I set it to cell or row header, then if I click in a cell, I'm selecting that cell. If I click in the row header, then I would select the row. But notice here that I actually can't click in the row headers because my cursor is taller than any of the rows. So if I make these rows larger, then I can click in the row header like that. So interestingly, I guess when I put this into production, I need to make my rows a little taller because here's a good instance of the cursor being too tall. The selection mode property determines whether or not I can select one or more rows. By default, it's set to extended, which means I can select multiple rows. So I can click in a row header and select a row. Actually, let's set this back to full row. I can select a row and then hold down the Shift key and select another row, and it will select all of the rows in between. Or I can select a row. I want to select one row. There we go. Hold down the Control key and select multiple rows. Or I can hold down the Control key, Shift, and select all of those rows. Hold down the Control key to select this row, and then hold down the Shift key and select all of those. Or I can set this to single, and I can only select one row at a time. And all of those are properties of the data grid. So let's go back into the code. And here I'm setting the header's visibility property of the grid, or the grid line's visibility property, or the selection unit, and then finally selection mode. By default, the user can reorder columns, so I can take this contact title and drag it over here. There we go. Or I could take customer ID and drag it over here. If I don't want to allow that to happen, then all I need to do is set the can user reorder columns property to false, and then I can't do that anymore. By default, the user can resize columns manually. If I uncheck this and set the Can User Resize Columns property to false, then I no longer have the ability to do that. Similarly, the user can resize rows. If I turn that off, then the user can't do that. So in this case, I've set Can User Resize Rows to false. And then finally, if you click in a column header, by default, that column will be sorted, either ascending or descending. I can turn that off as well by setting the Can User Sort Columns property to false. So in this example, when I let the runtime create columns for every property in the customer object, I have to scroll backwards and forwards to see information. Another option is to display only some of the information in the grid, and then if I select a customer, see the rest of the information in text boxes below. And that's pretty simple to set up. Let's go into the Simple Data Grid 2 Windows XAML. Here I've set Auto-Generate Columns to false because I don't want the runtime to generate columns for me automatically. I'm going to define them myself. And I've set Selection Mode to single. So I've got a column in the grid for company name, one for contact name, one for contact title, then city, country, and phone. And those are the only things I want to appear in the grid. And then each item in the grid is a customer object. So then all I really need to do is create a second grid below the data grid and bind that grid to the selected item in the customer's data grid, and then just bind the text boxes in that grid to properties of the customer object. And then that way I can see additional information for each customer below the data grid when I select a customer. So you've just seen that you can display all of an item's information in a data grid. So our first example was a data grid that displayed all of the information for a customer. You can do that, but you typically won't. You saw one way around that, which is to have a grid with text boxes below the data grid. Another way is to use a row detail section in the data grid. And the way a row details section works is that you select a row, and then the row details section expands to display additional information. So it basically works like an expander control, where it has a collapsible region of content. And to define what the content is, you can use a data template and specify what information you want to display in the row details section and what it should look like. And then you can use the Row Details Visibility Mode property of the data grid to control when the row details section appears. So you use a data template to control how it appears, and then that property to control when it appears. So let's go look at row details. Here's the Row Details window. What we're going to do here is display some customer information by default in the grid, and then the rest of it using row details sections. So let's see how this works, and then we'll explore how we accomplish it. So by default, we just see company name, contact title, and phone. Now, what happens when we want to see the rest of the information? All we need to do is select a customer, and then the row details section appears with the rest of that customer's information. Select another customer, and we always have typically have one row details section. If you select multiple ones, then multiple row details sections appear. So I've set the selection to single instead of the default of extended, right? Because if I do this, then I just get a whole bunch of row detail sections because all of those are selected. So be aware that's the default behavior, and then decide whether or not that's what you want. You would think I would know this before coming in, but there's always something new to learn. Okay, so how do we define this? Let's go into the XAML for this. Here's our grid, customers data grid. Auto-generate columns is set to false, and I define my 4 columns. And then I use a row details template. So datagrid.row details template, and I'm going to use a data template. The reason I'm using a data template is I'm specifying how this information is displayed. So I want a border of thickness 0, but I want a background of blanched almond. So this is blanched almond. Then I'm going to put in a grid, and that grid is going to contain data-bound text boxes, and they're bound to the information I want to display: address, city, region, postal code, etc. So just a normal grid with text boxes bound to the grid item. And that's it. So I create a row details template, define the template, and then automatically, when I select a customer, that row details section appears templated as I defined it. Now you have some control over when row details appear. By default, they appear when selected. And so there is a row details visibility mode property of the data grid that is set to visible when selected. I can also choose to display all of the detail sections, so when I click visible, notice that they all appear. And what I've done, if we go look at the code here, is I set the row details visibility mode to visible, and then I updated the layout of the grid, and they all appear. And if I set it to collapsed, then they all collapse. And I just set the row details visibility mode to collapsed and then updated the layout. The default is visible when selected. So I can have a button here that says show all, show none, or just leave it as visible when selected. So the row details section is a great way to display additional information without taking up more space in the window itself. So you've seen that the default behavior of a data grid is that at runtime it automatically adds columns. And you've also seen that you can define the columns yourself in XAML. You set auto-generate columns to false, and then you define the columns. But that's all at design time. At runtime, you can also add and remove columns in code. You can add columns by calling the add method of the data grid's columns collection. And then to remove a column, you can call the remove or the remove at method of the columns collection. If you call remove, you're going to pass the column object. If you call remove at, you'd pass an index. Users can select items in the data grid, and then you'll typically do something. So maybe they want to delete a customer or view additional information on one or more orders. You need to know which items they selected. And you can use the selected items property of the data grid, because that will contain a collection of the selected items. Now, what are these items? They're actually going to be of different types depending on your data source. If the data grid's bound to a data table in a data set, then each item is a strongly typed data row. If you're using LINQ, such as LINQ to SQL, and that query returns all of the columns, then each item's an instance of a data class: customer, order, etc. But it turns out that if you return only some of the information, so let's say you have a LINQ query that returns only 5 columns from the customer class, then each item in the grid is no longer an instance of the customer class, it's actually an anonymous class. Why do I bring this up? Let's go see. Here's the Working with Data Grids in Code 1 window. I have 2 examples of working with data grids in code. Here's the first one. And what I'm going to do in this window is display customers. I'm only going to display the company name, and then I'm going to be able to click that More Info button and see additional information. So let's run this. And when the window appears, here are all the customers, but I can only see company name. Now if I want to see additional information, what can I do? So far you've seen an example where we had a grid below the data grid and we had DataBond text boxes in there to display additional information. Then you saw using a row details section. Here's a third option, which is when I click More Info to just add those additional columns to the grid. And what I've also done is frozen the first column so that as I scroll right to left, the company name column stays where it is. And then if I'm done looking at that additional information, I can click Less Info and those columns disappear. So let's see the code that accomplishes that. If I click the More Info button, then I'm going to add these 5 columns to the grid and then freeze the first column. So frozen column count set equal to 1. Now this add text column, I'm passing in 2 arguments. The first is the data that the column is bound to, and the second is the header. So I first create a new instance of DataGrid text column, and then I set its binding property to a new binding based on a property. So for example, contact name. Here's the property contact name, and I'm going to add a new column bound to that. And then the header is contact space name. So add a new DataGrid text column, set its binding, set its header, and then add it to the collection of columns in the grid. And I'm going to do that for contact name, city, country, phone, and fax. And so when I do that, those 5 columns now appear in the grid, and then I've set frozen column count equal to 1, so that as I scroll backwards and forwards, the company name doesn't move. And now when I click Less Info, what I'm going to do is call the remove_at method, and the remove_at method takes an index. So I'm going to start at 5, work my way down to 1. I start with remove_at5, which is column number 5, or the 6th column, and I remove that, and I keep doing that until I've removed all of these columns. So I can add and remove columns at runtime by calling columns.add or columns.remove_at. If I had a reference to the column itself, I could call remove and pass that column object. Now I want to know what customers I selected, so let's say I select this group of customers. If I click Show Selections, I can now see who I selected. How do we do that? Pretty straightforward. I loop through the selected items in the data grid, and each of those are instances of the customer class. So for each cust in customers data grid.selected items, and cust is a customer, then I display the company name. So because the items in the grid are instances of the customer class, they're customer objects, it's very easy to read the company name. In our second example, we're going to create columns at runtime, but this time we're going to create the entire grid. Sometimes I want to see customers, sometimes I want to see categories, sometimes I want to see products. I didn't want to create 3 different windows, each with a grid. I certainly didn't want to create 3 different grids, so I've got one grid, and then I'm going to populate it with customers, or categories, or products at runtime. So let's go see first the XAML for this. Here's the grid, and I set auto-generate columns to false, and then in the code I'm going to define the columns. So if I click customers, then I'm going to run a link to SQL query to bring back customer ID, company name, city, country, and phone. I'm not bringing back all of the information from the customers table because all I want are these 5 columns, and I'm never going to display the other ones, so why bother bringing them down? So the item source of the grid is the results of running this query. Bring me back these 5 pieces of information. And then I'm going to add 5 columns to the grid. And this add text column method is the same one that we just saw. Add a new data grid text column, set its binding, set its header, add it to the collection of columns in the grid. If I bring down categories, I'm bringing down the category ID, the category name, and the number of products in that category. So if I click categories, ID, name of the category, number of products. And if I do products, then I'm bringing down the product ID, the product name, the supplier's name, and the price. Okay. So that's pretty straightforward. But what happens if I want to see who I've selected? I'm going to set a breakpoint on this code because it's not as straightforward as it was before. Okay, so now I've selected 4 customers. I want to see them. I click Show Selections. And now I'm going to loop through all of the items in Selected Items. What's in the grid? What is item? What is item? Well, item is an object, but it is not a customer object, because the only thing in there is customer ID, company name, city, country, and phone. I don't have a class that is defined with those 5 properties. I have a customer class, but it has more information. So item is not an instance of the customer class, even though it has properties. What it is actually is an anonymous class. And the reason it's an anonymous class, again, is because when I was filling out this grid, I decided in my query to only bring down the information I was going to show. So the benefit is that's more efficient. The downside is the items in the grid are now anonymous classes. So how do you read properties of anonymous classes? Well, you use reflection. So the first thing I'm going to do is call getType. So now item type is a type, and we can see that it's an anonymous type. And then, since I called customers, I'm going to call the getProperty method of the type class and tell it, get the property called company name. Again, there is a property called company name. Go get it. Now, why can't I just write that kind of code at design time? Well, it's because at design time, there is no company name property. It's only at runtime. So I can't write item.company_name. So I use reflection and I call getProperty to get the company name property. Now propInfo is a reference to that property name. Then I can call propInfo.getValue and read the value of that property, which is the company name I'm looking for. And then I can also do that for each of the categories and each of the products that I've selected.